Good afternoon. It's Friday the 24th of March 2023, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Fantastic to be with you, Mike.
And we have Vanessa Beeley from Damascus, as usual, by video link. Now, we're going to start off with France, of course. And yesterday was, all kinds of hell going on as far as the French were concerned. Let's bring the map on screen. Something like 300 protests around the country, the red dots representing just some of them. Right across the country. Most of the mainstream press suggesting that this is all about protest against the what they're describing as unpopular pension reforms. But as we mentioned on last Friday's programme, the pension reform certainly started something, but it was the government's reaction to the protests that really kicked people off. So let's just remind ourselves what Elizabeth Borne did last week. She invoked at Macron's behest Article 49.3 of the French Constitution. And if we just remind ourselves what that was about, it's about forcing a bill through Parliament without a vote. So it allows the Prime Minister, after deliberation by the Council of Ministers, to force a bill through the Assemblée Nationale with no vote. The only alternative to prevent the bill from passing then is to overthrow the government. When the Prime Minister triggers this procedure, MPs have the option of tabling a vote of no confidence within 24 hours. If a majority vote is obtained, the law is rejected and the government collapses. The next logical move would be for the President to dissolve the Assembly and call early elections. Now, there were two votes of no confidence brought, or
motion to censure
of no problem. Yes, brought one by the opposition and one by Marine Le Pen. Both were defeated, but the one that was brought by this sort of so-called moderate opposition, where I think it was only 9 votes in it or something like that. So it was very, very close.
And Macron's party didn't even show up. Le Renaissance didn't even bother to show up. That tells you how much democracy is thriving in France.
Yes. So the pension issue clearly at the centre of this, but the bigger issue of democracy, largely ignored by the mainstream press as they're discussing this. That is the main thing.
And on the back of very unpopular vaccine mandates, the vaccine passport protests, Mike, we reported on that last year. Those were raging for weeks. And so this isn't the first time they've invoked the 49.3 in the Constitution. So he's used it multiple times, and the people are absolutely fed up.
Right. So this was what happened yesterday. Then people out in Paris, I believe, Vanessa, this was the Place de la Bastille. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Huge crowds. I think there were reported to have been more than 800,000. I mean, just incredible. I was there in 2019 when the Gilets jaunes protest started. And even back then, 50,000, 100,000 was considered massive. 800,000. And this is across the country, Mike. This isn't only in Paris.
Well, indeed. So then on the motorways, we had the farmers coming out and setting fire to hay bales, blocking the traffic on motorways, roads, right across the country. Then we've got a little bit of video here from Marseille, and in a second, Vanessa will tell us what they're shouting, but let's have a listen to this. So, Vanessa, what were they chanting?
I couldn't actually hear that one very well. Sorry.
That's okay. No problem. But then, as the day wore on, more fires started. So, this is Bordeaux Town Hall. So the mayor is probably a pretty unhappy person today. We've got there's a little bit of video showing them burning the Bordeaux Town Hall. But perhaps the most, not sure how to describe it, but let's just go back to the Place de la Bastille and what happened later on at night. We've got a little bit of video from this, and then we'll tell you what they were saying. Vanessa.
Okay. This one I can translate. It basically is saying this is where we beheaded Louis XIV, and Macron, we can start again. So that's a fairly clear message.
A very clear message. And
President Macron.
And I don't know if you saw Charlie Hebdo, but Charlie Hebdo had this. So let's bring Charlie Hebdo. They had a little animated thing that they tweeted out yesterday. There you go, Macron's head coming off from the guillotine, and they're asking, will it rebound? So
cruel satire.
Cruel satire, but I do wonder how much satire is in it, Vanessa. I mean, is this how serious are people here? Is this a real threat, or are they being satirical, or what do you think about the French mood?
Well, the French mood, I mean, he's got the lowest approval rating for 35 years, which is 28%. People are voting in huge majorities to impeach him. There were other scenes where they were actually singing the Katyusha and calling, I think, tongue-in-cheek, for Putin to come and rescue them from their authoritarian dictatorship. You know, this is actually, as I said, this has been going on since 2019, but it has its roots back in the early 2000s when austerity measures started to creep in, and there was a clear class divide in France that just got wider and wider and wider until Macron came in and basically, you know, it has ever since been running it for the globalist cabal, and people are sick of it. And as you said, it's not only about pensions. This is about pretty much everything, including Ukraine, of course, the supplying of weapons to Ukraine while imposing austerity measures. And Macron basically coming out and saying that he agrees with the people, but basically tough luck. I mean, that's equivalent to, as you said this morning, Mike, let them eat cake.
Yes.
A great comment from the chat box. Pandora Chaser says, new headline for Charlie Hebdo, bounce back better.
Bounce back better, okay.
I like that.
Okay, well, of course, King Charles was supposed to make a visit to France in the next couple of weeks. That has now been postponed, so Emmanuel Macron here. I'm not sure that this photograph was taken yesterday. It could be because I believe he's not really too keen for his face to be seen at the moment in public. But anyway, Emmanuel Macron has issued a request to the British government that King Charles does not go to France in the next little while because he thinks it's too dangerous. So he's saying, no, can't do that. But look, let's. I mean, obviously, these protests. There's still a few things happening today. It's not anywhere on the scale of yesterday, but there's still some stuff happening today. People clearly extremely motivated in France at the moment, but a lot of there was quite a lot of the video footage showing quite brutal treatment of the protesters by some of the militarized police, but. Okay, the militarized police have got their batons and their shields and their body armor and so on. But what about the day-to-day gendarmes, Vanessa?
Well, I mean, the day-to-day gendarmes have had a hard time of it since, as I said, the Gilets jaunes protest started back in 2019, November from memory. And there's been a massive increase in suicide amongst the regular gendarme. And you also have to remember that many of the kind of balaclavaed, face-hidden officers that you're seeing on the streets beating people up, or even using the LBD launchers, the kind of rubber bullet, or the encirclement grenades that can take off people's hands and seriously damage limbs if they're thrown into a crowd environment, are private security agents. That was proven back in 2019. And in a lot of the footage, you see them wearing jeans and then just a black jacket, the helmet, all of the weapons that they've been given. But their faces are hidden. The usual police, you won't see them like this. And of course, the rate of suicide has been on the increase for some time amongst the French police forces, but since the start of the 2019 protests, it has dramatically increased. And so this was from Euronews in 2019. So far this year, 28 French police officers have committed suicide compared to 14 for the same period last year. Overall, 35 took their own lives in 2018, and I think in this year, in 1 month, there were 12 suicides. Over the past 5 years, an average of 44 members of the police forces committed suicide every year in France. A peak of 55 was registered in 2014. So actually, it was basically from when Macron came to power. And this is one of the main police unions, BIGI, talking about more than 100 suicides since they registered their complaint to Cazeneuve, basically, in Castaner, the ministers of interior in France. And basically they're saying, we're asking you to go to kill yourself at work, to commit suicide. So I think this was in 2022, Mike. I can't read
that's
the
right. Yes,
date
yes.
from here. Yeah. So, this is a major issue. The media is playing it that basically the Gilets jaunes are forcing the police to commit suicide. They're calling for them to commit suicide. This is absolute nonsense. What it actually is the genuine police forces, many of whom have been joining the protesters, by the way, in the last few days, alongside the fire brigades, were forced to turn against their own people by the kind of the globalist cabal that is running France right now, and were forced into state-sanctioned violence against their own people, and were very poorly organized, poorly paid. Much of the overtime they were forced to do to deal with the protest was unpaid. Quite incredible, really.
Yes, but we're seeing protests now spread. Obviously, we've had the Dutch farmers. We've had protests in Germany. I wonder, is Italy going to get join the club in the not too distant future?
Perhaps. I think the other thing I noticed is they said that the police were having to face smaller groups of protesters who were more mobile and moving around a lot, and they're having trouble reacting to that. So the protesting's adapted to some of the police tactics. And before we go, Vanessa, there was a special detachment. You may or may not be familiar, but I was told there was a special detachment, like a special territorial detachment, like a unit of police that are more violent than the other regulars, and that started under the Gilets jaunes. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they tend to wear the blue armband and the blue band on their helmet. Now, I can't remember if it's the SBU. I think it's the SBU. They were. I mean, when I went to one of the main protests to commemorate all of the injured up until that point, and we got cattled in the Place de la République, and we were being forced into the place where, of course, then they would fire tear gas. And then once people started trying to break out, they would charge with batons and the LBDs and the grenades. And I actually had an elderly lady with me and a tourist that were trying to leave. And I remember speaking to one of the SBU police and explaining it to him. And he just looked at me. He said, I don't care. Like, we're pushing everyone. And then they literally did. Even those that were collapsing from the tear gas, the paramedics were not allowed in. I was told by women there that they would sometimes cattle them for up to 6 hours. And there was one woman who told me, they don't even allow us out to go to the toilet. We have to do it in front of the police. So this is, complete humiliation tactics here.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. Let's move on then to Xi in Moscow. Now, this visit ended on Wednesday. Of course, we didn't see the conclusion of it before we had the news on Wednesday. So I just wanted to add a couple of bits to what we had on Wednesday. So this was the comments of Vladimir Putin at the press conference at the end. As of the end of the first of 3 quarters of 2022, the share of the ruble and the yuan in mutual commercial transactions reached 65% and continues to grow, which allows us to protect mutual trade from the influence of third countries and negative trends on global currency markets. The timing of that is spectacular because, of course, we have more and more evidence of Western banking system and Western currencies under massive stress at the moment. We'll be talking about Deutsche Bank towards the end of the program. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation and development. And of course, sanctions have been driving this to a large degree.
And oil supplies from Russia to China are way up.
Yes.
So they're almost to the point where Russia said they've recovered, or they've almost recovered all their lost trade from European sanctions. So that's also a big economic indicator.
Yes, but the one thing that I wanted to highlight was the China-Ukraine peace plan, because China has announced a plan for Ukraine. Well, this is basically, I'm just going to cover the main points of it and then ask for a comment from Patrick and Vanessa here. So first of all, the key point was respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Second point was abandoning Cold War mentality. The third point was ceasing hostilities, then resuming the peace talks, resolving humanitarian crisis, protecting civilians and prisoners of war, then keeping nuclear power plants safe, reducing strategic risks, and by that they're talking about nuclear risks in particular. And of course, it was interesting that Putin had, we're going to be talking about depleted uranium a little bit later again, Putin had framed the depleted uranium issue as a nuclear issue. But anyway, then facilitating grain exports, stopping unilateral sanctions, and keeping industrial and supply chains stable, and finally promoting post-conflict reconstruction. So Vanessa, what were your thoughts on this deal? I mean, I actually recommend everybody reads the full text of it, because just listing the headings doesn't go into it. We really should go into more depth on it if we had time. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? While the UK is talking about criminally supplying depleted uranium warheads to Ukraine for use against probably the civilian areas of Donbass, here you have China that has already brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, coming in with what is, I mean, there's not a single point on there that you can argue with, right? If you are genuinely looking to resolve conflict in this world. And what is shocking is the absolute opposite that is being presented by the West. The West has never, all it has done is renege on any form of negotiation or peaceful resolution of this conflict, right? And here is China presenting something that we should be demanding from every single one of our leaders in the EU, the UK, and the US, Canada, etc. We're not getting it.
No, indeed. And in fact, the Western response to this was appalling.
And tepid as well. An uneasiness in Washington, D.C., according to sources at the State Department. So what I think is extraordinary here, and of course this is going to upset Americans because they're completely gone into China-phobia mode in the last couple of years. But there's a vacuum, Mike. Because the U.S. and Britain's policy, NATO's policy, is no peace negotiations. Didn't Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, say now is not the time for peace?
Yes.
Not until there's a victory in Ukraine? Okay, so they've said it right there. So there's going to be no peace talks. So China's moved into the vacuum. Okay, and what did America used to do for years? They were regarded as the arbiter of negotiations of peace because most countries trusted them. Not all, but many did. But now that doesn't seem to be the case. They're not even available for peace talks. China's taken the opportunity. They've moved in. They're presenting themselves as an alternative, and they've offered to Zelensky, yeah, we're going to arrange a phone call. When is that phone call going to happen? I don't know. They were expecting Xi to go to Kiev for the photo op, and with Zelensky, and of course the Chinese delegation's like, we're not going to be used for a photo op, and we're not going to show up in Kiev. So it's non-starter. So they've gone to Moscow. The other counterparties, the United States, if they want to approach, certainly they can. But the problem, Mike, is, and Vanessa and everybody listening, the U.S. cannot actually be a party to any negotiations because they're directly fueling and arming the conflict. They're not a neutral party. They're a belligerent. So is Britain. So that's the fundamental problem with this. So this reminds me of the Syrian war, where the West and John Kerry and everyone's chomping at the bit to have peace talks in Switzerland. And what happened? Russia Damascus and other parties put a coalition together, including the moderate rebels, so to speak, and they had the Astana conferences, the Astana process. And what happened there, and that drove Washington crazy because the center of gravity geopolitically drifted towards Asia, away from the Atlantic, away from Switzerland to Asia. This is exactly what's happening here. This is a fundamental paradigm shift in geopolitics right now. We're witnessing it once again.
And Vanessa, just very briefly, I mean, I just want to come back to point number one, respecting everybody's sovereignty. This is something that, of course, we're not doing in the West.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, this is what we were talking about last week as well, the fact that President Assad is basically going against the advice, let's say, of Russia, China, Iran, reference a meeting with Erdogan, but Assad is saying, no, Erdogan is not meeting the guarantees that I need him to meet. Therefore, I refuse to give him the PR opportunity of a meeting with myself or even a foreign minister meeting or an intelligence chief meeting right now. And Russia, China, and Iran, who are the mainstay of the alliance that has sort of helped Syria keep itself afloat for the last 12 years, are accepting it because it's a sovereign nation, a sovereign government that is making sovereign decisions about its territorial integrity. And that is how international law should be applied. We were talking about this, Mike, and we don't apply it anywhere in the West. Nowhere do we respect territorial integrity or sovereignty.
Indeed.
And also the big criticism from the West is China's acting in its own selfish interest. Excuse me very much, but that's what great powers do in international relations. When do great powers not act in their interest? They act every single time. So no surprise there.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to Ukraine, and we'll start off with this article from TASS, because obviously the issue of Bakhmut continues to be an issue. And well, this headline is quoting the head of the Wagner Group. So Ukraine deployed over 80,000 servicemen around Bakhmut, according to the Wagner Group. So let's just look at some of the text. The Ukrainian armed forces have gathered over 80,000 servicemen around Bakhmut. This is according to the founder of the Wagner Group in a video we published yesterday on his Telegram channel. As of today, the quote says, the enemy has deployed more than 80,000 around Bakhmut. The grouping is in Seversk, Slovansk, Kramatorsk, and so on. And he went on to say the Ukrainians received a very large amount of various NATO equipment, various armored vehicles, Leopard tanks, which everyone is talking about, and prepared reserves of about 200,000 people. So it's looking like Ukraine is going to attempt to push back somewhat on the Bakhmut situation if these figures are true. But now on the issue of NATO equipment, I just want to put this image on screen. I want to say thank you very much to the person who sent this to me. This is a photograph from the border crossing between Slovakia and Ukraine. And I believe that is a Polish self-propelled gun. And well, there were several of them, quite a number of them, on trucks heading by train into Ukraine. So more NATO arms and armaments going in, probably on a daily basis, but it's just I was very pleased to receive documentary evidence of it.
And most of this is going to end up as scrap metal, unfortunately.
Yes.
And it's sorry, but that's just
that is absolutely
that's what's
the case.
been happening for the last 12 months.
But the question is, if there are 80,000 troops gathered around Bakhmut, ready to take part in some kind of counteroffensive, what's the mood within Zelensky's troops?
That's the big question, Mike. What is the morale like on the Ukrainian side? Reports that we're seeing is that it's really bad. It's never been worse, and so what you're looking at here is the Third Army. The First Army was already expended by the end of the spring of last year. Then came the Second Army and a whole new batch of NATO equipment, plus a new shipments of mercenaries, foreign fighters, contractors, and so forth. And that has more or less been extinguished or turned into casualties or cycled out as of the fall. Now you're looking at the Third Army. Okay, so they're really at the bottom of the barrel right now. So Zelensky has been deployed to do a PR trip to the front line. We've got footage of this. There's no subtitles. Okay, we'll play a minute or two. This Mike, I'm going to say this is the powerful piece of footage. Notice, everybody, when you watch this, notice the looks on the soldier's face when Zelensky is passing out little medals and various things to the, quote, heroes. Look at their faces and look at how nervous he is. And we'll come back and discuss this. Watch this powerful footage.
Бажаю здоров'я. Шановні панове офіцери, шановні солдати. Маю честь сьогодні бути тут, на сході нашої держави, на Донбасі. І маю честь нагородити кращих з наших героїв, подякувати вам, потиснути руку, подякувати за те, що захищаєте державу, суверенітет, схід України. Бачили сьогодні багато всього зруйнованого навколо, але найголовніше – це перемога. Після перемоги точно все відбудуємо. І така складна у вас доля, але така історична – захистити нашу землю і повернути все в Україну для наших дітей. Я вам дуже вдячний, кожному і кожній, хто захищає. Також дуже дякуємо і низький уклін всім тим героям, вашим близьким побратимам, яких втратили ви на Сході, в цілому на цій війні.
One thing I noticed there, that a lot of them weren't giving eye contact to Zelensky, and I thought that was quite telling. Totally staged, but you could see the look on their face. Very uncomfortable exchange. And also women, they made a point to show that they have women on the front line. That, to me, some people might say that's valiant in the West. I see that as a form of desperation, but that's my opinion.
Vanessa.
Also, it's very weird. I've watched that about 3 times now, but the lip syncing between Zelensky speaking and the actual, the voice that you're hearing is very weirdly out of sync. Did you notice? At least a couple of times.
It could have been
and it's almost like, did they do a voiceover? Or was it? No, it happens 2 or 3 times though, Pat.
It might be the degraded quality of the video, possibly. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. Good point. But it goes on.
Oh, it goes on. So no, this is a video that was posted by one of the Ukrainian units in the Bakhmut area that claim that they've been totally abandoned by their commanders and by their superiors. And there's subtitles on this. And I'm going to say, if we can play as much of this as possible, it is absolutely jaw-dropping. Watch this clip.
57-я бригада, 34-й БАТ. 17 числа забросили на позиции в окружение. Без поддержки артиллерии, без связи. Просто на броне закинули. Выходили полями, точки эвакуации нет, связи нет. Свои же крыли со всех сторон, чтобы, может, из-за того, что связь, но не было это. Прошло буквально 2 дня, нас пытаются послать туда же, рассказывая нам сказки, что позиции заняты, что позиции держатся, что работает артиллерия, но, зная всю ситуацию, мы в это не верим. Мы отказываемся заступать без поддержки брони, артиллерии, разведки, без карт минных полей, потому что выходили по растяжкам и всему остальному. У нас есть связь должна быть, коридор для выхода, средства эвакуации. Поэтому мы отказываемся без этого всего выполнять свои прямые обязанности. Теперь скажут ребята, что все думают об этом. Говорите. Любой, кто там, любой.
Я не довіряю. Я не йду. Нема довіри до командування частини. Опять хочуть нас надурити і хочуть кинути нас в м'ясорубку. І це в цій бригаді не перший раз. А це вже пішло вже 8 чи 9. Самі точно не знаємо. Ми не довіряємо. Не довіряємо.
Сами видите, да?
So even if let's say, I mean, we're not certain that the Wagner report is whether he's telling the truth or whether he's playing some kind of mind games or whatever it is. So, but let's say there are 80,000 troops waiting for some kind of counter-offensive in Bakhmut. Then the question is, what is their mindset? Are they actually engaged in this? Are they going to fight or are they going to run?
What type of troops are they? What did we just see there? We saw a lot of men in their 40s, 50s, a couple that look like they might be in their early 60s. So, I mean, these are not your regular top line units. And so this is a lot of what they have. We see a lot of reports of press gangs going around Ukraine in the last month or so.
Right.
So they've been snatching up people, throwing them a uniform on them, maybe giving them a little bit of basic training and throwing them out to the front line. Is this where all these big numbers are coming from? Now, I've also heard, and we'll talk about Poland in a minute, that there are a large number of Polish regulars who are now in the field and fighting and have been for months around Kharkiv. But we'll talk about the Polish situation in a minute.
A second, Vanessa.
Yeah, I was just saying that I read a couple of reports this morning and yesterday that the life expectancy of a Ukrainian soldier is now 4 hours. 4 hours. Just let that sink in while the UK, the US, and the EU are pushing these guys to their death, to their certain death. Right? I mean, it's just extraordinary. I don't know. I find it so. I found that video so heartbreaking, actually.
Yeah. Yes.
Very sad.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on then.
Yeah, so where's all the money going that's going to Kiev? That's a good question, isn't it? So on the question of Poland, let's take a look at this. So a statement was made by the Polish ambassador to France, and I tweeted this out. We didn't have time to get the translation, but this is what we're saying here. When NATO's Ukrainian meat grinder runs out of men, Washington is preparing Poland as their next round of fodder. Poland is now amassing an army of 300,000. That's what they're wanting to amass, they say, the Polish representatives, intending to fight Russia in 2024 in the event of the defeat of the armed forces of Ukraine. And here's the quote here. This was the meaning of the statement made earlier by Ambassador of Poland to France, Jan Emmerich Roshinsky.
Good luck with that one.
Roshinsky. Okay. If Ukraine fails to defend its independence, we'll have no choice. We will be forced to enter into the conflict, said the diplomat on air of the LCI TV channel here. This was just a few days ago. What do you notice about that statement? It fails to defend its independence. I'm going to ask the question, is Ukraine actually independent right now? And I'm going to say it's not.
It's absolutely not.
It has 0% sovereignty, bottom of the sovereignty index.
And that's got nothing to do with Russia.
No, this doesn't.
And so let's come on to the depleted uranium issue then.
Sure. And I want to make a comment about the Polish situation after this because I think it's pertinent. But so you've seen the reports from Britain, Russian ministers saying that really decrying, calling out Britain shipping DU munitions into Ukraine. Now, you remember, Mike, back in May, we reported this story at the UK column here. This is an excellent report by the French journalist Freddie Ponton. This is an exhaustive study of all the weapons that went in by May into Ukraine. And the biggest offender on depleted uranium, it's pretty certain, confirmed that France has been trafficking DU munitions into Ukraine now for the better part of a year. Britain as well, within the NLAW and anti-tank systems, many of them use, including the Javelin systems, many of them use DU rounds, okay? So France bought a bunch of Javelins from the US years ago. They immediately shipped those directly into Ukraine last spring. So there's depleted uranium there from France. The United States, other guns and surface-to-airs and Mistral systems, all sorts use DU. So this is a really good article. If you want to go and pull this up, anybody who's researching, it's got all of the source documents in there. And basically it's a chapter and verse, all the DU weaponry that has been shipped into Ukraine in at least the first part of the conflict. So that's well documented. So Britain's now has this next round, and we'll go to the next image here. And so this is the Dutch journalist. I think she's on the ground in Donbass. She's done amazing work. Sonia van den Indian. The Western world is out of control and doesn't seem to realize the danger they pose to themselves and, of course, Russia. It's pure criminal to use depleted uranium, but that's what they did in Iraq. They have to be on trial, always the leaders, she said. Now, Yugoslavia, there was also a lot of DU munitions used in Yugoslavia by NATO forces. So this isn't the first time that this type of toxic, radiological, completely dangerous material has been dumped into a battle zone. They did it in Yugoslavia with the NATO takedown of that country. So she mentioned Iraq as well. I think in Syria, there's probably many reports of depleted uranium being used by some of the parties there, the terrorist factions and so forth. I don't know what Israel uses, but I'm sure that they might use these as well. So, but this is a big problem. You have all this agricultural land, grain supplies. Who's going to map this out? Who's going to put in restricted areas? Who's going to clean it up? The water supply, the food supply, all coming out of Ukraine. Does the West care about this?
Well, they should care, because we should not forget that, of course, Ukraine, under normal circumstances, Ukraine exports a significant proportion of what it grows. Most of Ukrainian agriculture has now been bought up by Western corporations, which means Ukrainian food is going to be finding its way onto Western dinner plates. Is it going to be contaminated Ukrainian food finding its way onto Western dinner plates? Or
Donetsk and Lugansk food, because a lot of these munitions from the West are going to end up in the Donbass,
yes,
as it stands right now. So that's a big problem. They don't have any problem dumping this stuff in what's now the Russian Federation. And I think that's a very cynical move by the Western countries. Where are the environmental protesters? Where's Greta Thunberg on this?
Vanessa.
Well, of course, not forgetting that today is the anniversary of the NATO bombing of Serbia, where, of course, they did also use depleted uranium. And just in Syria, the bombing, the publicized or the admitted use of depleted uranium was in 2015, when the US used it to bomb an alleged ISIS convoy. Now, they could have destroyed that convoy with ordinary missiles, so why did they use depleted uranium? And as you said, the residue of that depleted uranium remains in Syria. No one has cleaned it up. Whoever cleared up the scrap metal from the bombing campaign against ISIS, which is known to be a US proxy anyway, are going to be contaminated. I mean, it's between nuclear and bioweapon, because, of course, what does it do for generations? It ensures birth defects, deformations. Look at what's going on in Iraq since it was used there. I mean, it's utterly reprehensible. It's disgusting.
It is. It's a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process. It's stuff that should be stored as nuclear waste, but because it's twice as heavy and twice as dense as lead, they can put a smaller amount so they can reduce the size of the munitions, but make them more powerful. And it cuts through tanks and steel and armor piercing like a hot knife through butter. And it's also very lucrative in terms of arms sales, if you're in the business of packaging and selling this stuff. So.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's move on then to the pipelines. And of course, Seymour Hersh has brought a new article out.
Yeah, this was on his Substack recently. This is quite an amazing story here. This is from a few days ago. So Seymour Hersh is basically saying this is his latest release on this. He's saying that there is a cover-up. You remember the story a few days ago or last week, Mike, that, or was it 2 weeks ago, a pro-Ukrainian rogue cell, that's who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. It could have been, but not even, we don't know who. They rented a boat in Poland, all very mysterious. I'm waiting for Daniel Craig to come abseiling down from a helicopter on that one. But here's Seymour Hersh. So this is what he's saying here. This is the takeaway. The CIA asked this month to collaborate with German intelligence to produce a pipeline explosions cover story to, quote, pulse the system. So that would have been in direct reaction to Seymour Hersh's original article, I believe, which came out at the end of January.
Yes.
So it's been, a little over a month or a month and a half or something like that. So here's what he's saying. The Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, had flown to Washington during this period with no members of the German press on board his special transport, no formal dinner scheduled, and the two world leaders were not slated to conduct a press conference, as what routinely happens at such high-profile meetings. Instead, it was later reported that Biden and Scholz had an 80-minute meeting with no aides present for much of the time. And they go on. Here, there have been no statements or written understandings made public since then by either government, but I was told by someone with access to diplomatic intelligence that there was a discussion of pipeline expose, my expose, Hersh says. As a result, certain elements of the Central Intelligence Agency were asked to prepare a cover story in collaboration with German intelligence that would provide the American German press with an alternative version of destruction of Nord Stream 2.
Yes. And then it goes on to say, in the words of the intelligence community, the agency was to pulse the system in an effort to discount the claim that Biden had ordered the pipeline's destruction. So this is obviously Hersh finding a way to, he's bringing new information forward, which is demonstrating how the other certain interests are trying to cover this story up. And of course, we've got the yacht story. We've got all kinds of stories coming out at the moment over this.
So what does that mean? Well, here's the original story in the New York Times, Mike. Intelligence suggests pro-Ukrainian group sabotages pipeline. Look at these three stooges at the bottom that authored this thing for looks like for the CIA. So what do we call this? Well, good old-fashioned fake news. There you are.
Well, let's end this segment then with, ice cream.
With ice cream, and would you believe it, Ben and Jerry's, Ben Cohen, who is a raging progressive liberal, total Democrat, Biden supporter. They come out with a new ice cream here against the U.S. military support for Ukraine. Can you believe this? So look at this. This is the new flavor of Ben and Jerry's. Honestly, I want to get my hands on this one. It's called No Ukrainian Dough. Chunky surrender monkey. It's got money in the background. So I love this, especially coming from woke Ben and Jerry's. I'm totally supporting Ben and Jerry's now.
Okay, let's move on to Syria. And Vanessa, we mentioned briefly on Monday or Wednesday the fact that President Assad had visited to UAE for the first time in quite some time, at least in the sense of an official visit. So let's bring him on screen here, and maybe you could tell us a bit more in detail of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, this was an extraordinary meeting. As you said this morning, the Western media downplayed it as being a pretty standard meeting. But as I was discussing with Kevork Almasyan this morning, the president's plane, and how wonderful it is to see Syrian Airlines back on the runway in UAE. Here he is being met by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. But the plane itself was actually escorted onto the runway in the air by UAE fighter jets. And as Kevork pointed out to me this morning, it's the high likelihood that those jets were American. The UAE, Abu Dhabi in particular, is an absolute headquarters in the Middle East of American, Israeli, and UK intelligence, including many of the intelligence agencies that were behind, for example, the creation of the White Helmet, that were embedded with the armed groups inside Syria and produced the majority of the propaganda to criminalize the Syrian government. That's analysis, research, and knowledge established by a suspected MI6 agent himself, Alistair Harris. They're based in UAE, so is Good Harbor International. James Lemessurier, the founder of the White Helmets, who was also working for ARK at the time, also had a consultancy position at Good Harbor International that was started up by Richard Clarke of the Bush era, of course. So quite extraordinary to see President Assad received in such a way in UAE, who also have very close ties with Israel, of course, particularly in the devastation of Yemen since 2015. And here we have the First Lady, Asma al-Assad, who accompanied her husband on this trip and sort of performed a lot of duties herself while she was there. And he brought what in Syria they're now calling Team Assad, the selection of ministers, including finance, economy, foreign ministers, defense ministers. The same team came that had previously gone to Moscow for the president's meetings with President Putin. And quite extraordinary trade deals were put together. And if we, in a second, we'll look at the video, but what I want to point out about the conversation between the two presidents, people would expect maybe after 12 years war, hybrid war, sanctions, the theft of resources, the annexation, occupation of Syrian territory. I don't know how many, perhaps up to 40 American military bases on Syrian soil. One might perhaps expect President Assad to be slightly cap in hand and going to these nations that were, to some extent, for the UAE, responsible for the destruction and the destabilization in Syria. And yet, actually, he's gone very much from a strong position. And when you listen to his language, one has the impression, and I've talked this through with a number of people here, that actually it is the president of UAE who's very slightly on the back foot and who is doing his utmost to reassure President Assad that Syria was missed, that Syria is now back in the brotherhood of Arab nations. And of course, we're hoping that probably the next step will be being allowed back into the Arab League. But let's have a look at the video now.
غيبتكم يا السوريين غيبة طولت واشتقنا لكم، فحان الوقت أن سوريا ترجع إلى محيطها العربي، إلى إخوانها العرب. نحن نحاول نبني معكم علاقة ومد جسور وتقوية هذا الجسر بيننا وبين أهلنا في سوريا فائدة الطرفين. أحسن الله عزاكم في أهلنا في سوريا، وإن شاء الله بقيادتكم وبهمة السوريين هذه تحدي بتحدونه. أخوانكم في الإمارات قلبا وقالبا معكم.
شكرا لكم سمو الشيخ. من لم يشكر الناس لم يشكر الله، وبالتالي لابد من البدء من الشكر. السوريين اليوم لما عم يحكوا بعد هالشهر اللي مر بيقول لك الواضح تماما انه طريقة مساعدة الإمارات مليئة بالمحبة، فهذا الشيء أغلى من أي شيء آخر بيتقدم، وإن شاء الله نحن كمان بدنا نكون أوفياء لهالعلاقة بنفس الطريقة. الشيخ زايد الله يرحمه عرفته بمواقف عابرة، الوالد هو اللي كان بيعرفه أكثر، كانوا مثل أخوي. أنا معرفتي فيه باللقاءات القليلة اللي صارت، وبنعرفه إنسان طيب ومحبوب وإلى آخره، ولكن الآن صرنا بنشوفه بشكل أوضح. بنعرف اليوم تماما ما هي الدولة اللي بناها ومن هي العائلة اللي أسسها.
الله يا أريد أكد فخامة الرئيس أن نحن إخوانكم وأهلكم وهذه بلدك. تشرفنا اليوم بوجودك وأتمنى إن شاء الله أن تكون زيارة نبني عليها هذا الجسر القوي لبناء علاقات تصب في مصلحة أهلنا هناك.
يسلم الله.
شرفتونا يا سيدي.
Vanessa, did that video come from the Syrian government or was it from UAE?
UAE.
Right.
Which is also sort of extraordinary because the language, I mean, what we're seeing now, the meetings between Xi Jinping and Putin, Assad and Putin, Assad and bin Zayed, the language is quite extraordinary. They're talking of devotion, friendship, family, trust. All as Patrick said, the vacuum that has been left by the criminality and the moral depravity of the West is now being filled with something that, me personally, I haven't heard for years. And literally, I think 2 days after the president returned from this meeting, Syria and Saudi Arabia agreed to reopen embassies. I've heard that it will be actually after Ramadan, which started yesterday, after Eid al-Fitr, which is the celebration for the end of Ramadan. So in about 1 month, the Saudi embassy, which, this is extraordinary. Saudi Arabia was responsible largely for much of the funding of groups like ISIS inside Syria, and was absolutely one of the strongest allies of the West in its attempt to achieve regime change inside Syria. And here we have Saudi Arabia basically holding out the hand of friendship, not only to Iran, but now to Syria. These are extraordinary times we're going through.
Okay, but in the meantime, of course, Israel and the United States not so happy about that. So let's start off with Israel then, and more bombings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was on, when was it? I'm losing track of time. 2 days ago at about 4 a.m., Israel again, for the third time since the earthquake, attacked Aleppo airport, causing some damage. It was actually more to the perimeter, but there was some small damage to one of the runways. Now, Aleppo airport, as we've mentioned before, is actually responsible for receiving much of the humanitarian aid for more than 3,000 refugees inside the government-protected areas of Syria. So this is just a video of the actual attack itself.
Yeah, so just keep talking.
Okay. Many of the, oh, sorry, what?
Yeah, just keep talking your way through that. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So many of the missiles were brought down by the Syrian air defense. But what Israel tends to do that people maybe don't understand is that they will fire salvos of missiles that they know the air defenses that are being used at the moment. There are other air defense systems that are not being used, that are being kept in abeyance for the potential for an escalation of conflict with Israel. So the air defenses can only bring down a fairly large percentage of the missiles, but at least one or two will hit target, and that's what happened in Aleppo. So what has happened also since the meeting in UAE, there has been a sort of a rebellion both from the UAE and from Jordan. Of course, Israel opened its embassy in the UAE in 2021, but here you have the UAE orders its envoy to Israel to not meet with government officials. The UAE, Jordan, Egypt, and Morocco are reportedly reconsidering their diplomatic ties with Israel in response to a senior Israeli official claiming that there is no such thing as the Palestinian people at a press conference in Paris. Have I lost you? Have I lost sound?
Oh, sorry, I do apologize, Vanessa.
No, it's all right, I didn't. So you also have the Jordanian foreign minister calls on the international community to oppose hate speech against Palestinians. And then if you go to the next slide, Mike, you can see exactly what they're both talking about. Jordan's Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi urged the international community on the 22nd of March to oppose the incitement of hate speech against Palestinians as it fuels violence and results in the violation of human rights. Now, what was he referring to? The disgusting manner in the statements, racist ideologies conveyed in a disgusting manner in the statements of the Israeli Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, who denied the existence of the Palestinian people and attempted to delegitimize their rights during a press conference in Paris. And he also used the map of the so-called Greater Israel that includes the Palestinian territories, Jordan, and parts of Syria. Hence, of course, Jordan's reaction against it.
Okay, so Jordan then their parliament has voted to expel the Israeli ambassador.
Yes, so basically now the Jordanian parliament votes to expel Israeli ambassador. Diplomatic crisis is brewing between Israel and several of its Arab partners, of course, due to the actions of Jewish supremacist officials. And again, if you move on. So here you have, we in the House of Representatives call on the government to take effective measures towards the occupation government's, notice the language also, the occupation government's finance minister's use of a map of the so-called Israel that includes the borders of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, the occupied Palestinian territories. The final decision to expel the Israeli envoy lies with the government and King Abdullah. During Wednesday's session, officials also displayed a map similar to the one used by Smotrich during a speech in Paris representing what he called Greater Israel. However, the map hung on the parliament floor bore the flag of Jordan and Palestine. So, this far-right supremacist government of Netanyahu is really ending up in hot water. And what does his son do? Yair Netanyahu, who is well known, as it says, for his incendiary comments, likens protesters against Netanyahu's policies, both in Palestine and abroad, to the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, taking it one step further than Western demonization of protests like the Yellow Vests as being fascist, neo-Nazi, red, brown, etc. Quite extraordinary at the moment what's going on in Israel itself. And of course, the danger is that what is Netanyahu going to do? And that's very much what we're seeing with provocations on the border with Lebanon, with the continued aggression against civilian infrastructure inside Syria. Netanyahu is going to be looking to export the war from internal to external. But of course, whoever he picks on, whether he goes for Lebanon, and that would mean Hezbollah, or whether he goes for Syria, he's going to have to take on both countries and also take into account countries like Yemen. And one also has to raise the question now, what would the UAE and what would Jordan do under those circumstances, or even Saudi Arabia? It's getting very interesting right now in Syria. So this, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead, because this is now the U.S. attack in Syria near Deir ez-Zor, and the timing of that seemed to be related to the visit to UAE
last night.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this was last night. Now, what they're claiming it's in response to was a Syrian allied resistance attack on one of the U.S. military bases, which ended up in the death of, let's say, a U.S. contractor. Many people are saying they were CIA agents that were killed, or one was killed, one was injured. And I think 3 U.S. soldiers were injured in the attack yesterday afternoon around 2 o'clock. They were taken for treatment, or some of them were taken for treatment in Iraq. And then the U.S. attack, which was obviously authorized by Biden, came later that evening and ended up with at least 5 casualties. They attacked a grain storage area and an agricultural center in Deir ez-Zor city itself. And this was the statement put out from CENTCOM, which I can't read terribly easily from the small print.
Well, it says
So
this evening we
basically,
responded to
yeah.
an attack on our forces that killed an American contractor and wounded our troops, another American contractor, by striking facilities used by groups affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We will always take all necessary measures to defend our people. The thoughts and prayers of U.S. Central Command are with the family of our contractor. Our troops remain in Syria to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, which benefits the security and stability not only of Syria, but the entire region.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite extraordinary because one, the US troops should not be in Syria. They shouldn't be stealing Syrian oil. They shouldn't be backing, equipping, arming, and sponsoring separatist groups or even ISIS. And recent reports are showing that they are now equipping ISIS with improved hardware, which is very probably coming through Ukraine, Turkey, or even through other areas, Iraqi Kurdistan, for example, into Syria to improve the performance of ISIS that are now being divided up into brigades of about 300 to carry out attacks against Russian and Syrian positions. Today, also, there was another Syrian allied resistance attack against the Al Omar oil field. So, things are definitely hotting up in Syria and definitely getting rather interesting over the next few weeks.
Sorry, Patrick.
What was interesting is that this was a drone attack, allegedly. So the U.S. is saying an Iranian drone attack killing a contractor. That's exactly a similar scenario to, you remember back in 2019, 2020, when one of the Hashid PMU units hit and killed a U.S. contractor. It turned out to be, I guess, a translator or something, and they blamed it on Katiba Hezbollah, one of the Hashid PMU brigades, and that started a chain of events with the retaliations, then an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and then the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and then the Iranians hitting 2 U.S. bases, and I think another facility in Iraqi Kurdistan. So a chain of events. So this is very interesting. I'm going to say that I think this is a signal of the beginning of the end of the U.S. Encampment in Syria. That's my personal opinion, and I don't know how long it's going to take, but that's what it feels like.
Okay, so we've had the Assad visit to UAE. We've had Israel bombing again, a US attack. But in the meantime, Syria and China getting very close as well. So this was Sana reporting this yesterday, and they're saying that the Syrian Prime Minister Hussein Arnous met with the ambassador of the People's Republic of China in Damascus to discuss bilateral relations, various areas of economic, political, strategic relations that are common to Syria and China. So they're obviously talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. Vanessa, I thought this was an interesting development and also a good introduction to just remind people, if we knew in the first place of the 5 Cs project, which might be one of the contributing factors for the Syrian war in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's almost, people are talking about a multipolar world as if it's some new invention that's only happened post-COVID, and it's only something that's coming into the lexicon now. But if we go back in history, and I'll demonstrate even further back in history to the Umayyad dynasty, but President Assad's 5 Cs project, which started in 2004, was basically the vision of making Syria the trade, economic, energy, food resource hub for the world, basically, because it included, the Red Sea wasn't initially included. It was initially the 4C project, which then became the the 5C project. So he launched it in 2004. The strategy, as I said, was to put Syria at the center of regional energy transportation, but also all other forms of trade globally. Pre-2011, President Assad visited many countries, and many agreements were drawn up between, for example, Lebanon, Turkey, Romania, Ukraine, Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, also Armenia, and I believe Egypt can be included in that. It would include a gas pipeline from Iran, which we know was another slap in the face of the Western agenda in Syria when Assad turned down the 2000 proposal of a pipeline that was going to be controlled by Qatar and then obviously under the control of the United States, and turned it down in favor of the Iranian pipeline, which would be very much an alliance with Russia. Pipeline into Turkey linking with the planned Nabucco gas pipeline from Azerbaijan, the restoration of oil pipeline from northern Iraq to Syria. That, of course, followed on from the Western devastation of Iraq and the taking over of those pipelines largely by the Iraqi Kurds. Huge project was in the pipeline, sorry for the pun, to build Syrian infrastructure, roads, to improve ports, to improve railways, to restore and put in new pipelines to fulfill the 5 Cs. And I've put there multipolar vision. In 2009, President Assad explained his idea. Have I cut that slide off?
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, 1 second. I will read it off here. He explained his idea that once the economic space between Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran becomes integrated, we would link the Mediterranean, Caspian, Black Sea, and the Persian Gulf. We aren't just important in the Middle East, he was saying. Once we link these 4 Cs, which then became 5, we become the unavoidable intersection of the whole world in investment, transport, and more. So this was proposing an independent south-to-south economy and trade paradigm, control of resources and sovereignty. 2010, China's Silk Road strategy converged with Damascus also. So this is a very clear indication of Syria was destabilized. But I also wanted to make the point that the Umayyad dynasty, one of the largest Muslim dynasties in 661 to 750, when it was actually 6 rather than 5 Cs, reaching as far as the Baltic Sea, where the Umayyad excelled as merchants rather than as politicians or military experts. So this was something that throughout history has been a vision of many of these, I would even call, the Assad dynasty, if you like. It's been a vision of these countries to create this multipolar world without this unipolar supremacist vision of the United States and the UK, for example. So this is not something new for these. Now is the opportunity to bring to fruition.
And we've lost Vanessa for now. Well, anyway, thank you for that, Vanessa. We'll move on. Right, look, if you like what the UK Column does, you'd like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. Your membership very much needed and appreciated. Or you can pick something up at the UK Column shop. But please do share material you find on the various platforms, including the UK Column website, of course, and also the UK Column Extracts website. Now let's come back to the UK, Patrick, and Boris Johnson and Partygate.
Back in the hot seat, Mike. So the clashes with MPs over Partygate denials. Who'd have thought this thing gets revived from the basement of Westminster, but yet Boris is facing a lot of accusations here about his lying and so forth. So this is interesting, and this follows on here. Let's go on and look at this tweet here. This is the political editor of The Guardian, Pippa Crayar, and she's basically reposting her notes in anticipation for, I believe, a documentary film that's coming up here. Fascinating insight on how Number 10 reacted to the initial query on Partygate here. So these are text messages or communications here. There she is, political editor of The Guardian here. But this is the one you want to pay attention to here, the last section here. And this is what it says. Jack Doyle, key thing is there was never any rules against workplace drinking, so we can say with confidence no rules were broken. Ignore the, quote, Xmas quiz BS. Who cares? Just be robust, and they'll get bored. So they're saying, how are they going to sell these parties that they're having? They're booking their Christmas parties, but what if the press find out? How are they going to announce it? So they're doing the strategy here. But isn't that interesting, Mike? Because when we reported this
at the time,
you said that these weren't actually in violation of any rules for
That's
workplace, right?
That's absolutely right. And so I'm still not clear. As far as I'm concerned, this looks more and more like distraction politics going on here because Boris absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, has a legitimate right to say there were no rules against Partygate. I think that's the case.
So this wasn't illegal. So why did they go through with the whole pantomime of it? Was it to create an exit strategy for Boris? That's what we said at the time, because he damaged his brand. The polling on him, he was hated by half the country, and this was a way to get him out with a sort of soft scandal, like a little MP's expenses type thing, or
yes,
not too bad. And so that, what did you say? This is what you said at the time, wasn't it?
Well, no. Well, I just wanted to highlight here. I mean, although Boris perhaps is in a position where he may not be absolutely breach the rules, the same could be said for Keir Starmer here. If we put this on screen, but if we look at the other people on this list, Neil Ferguson, he absolutely did break the lockdown rules. Dr. Catherine Calderwood, then the Scotland's chief medical officer, she broke the lockdown rules. Matt Hancock broke the lockdown rules. Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules. But then Tobias Ellwood, Robert Jenrick, Stephen Kinnock, then Margaret Ferrier MP, Bob Seeley MP, they all broke lockdown rules as well. So the question then had to be asked at the time, did any of them believe that there was actually a danger here, that these lockdown rules were there to prevent some kind of transmission of a virus, or did they actually believe that there was no virus and there was no problem about transmission, and so therefore they didn't need to worry about the lockdown rules? These were the questions at the time. But of course, we've got to remember, Patrick, that Boris, and if we're talking about whether he was telling the truth or not, Boris claimed to have had a brush with death when he caught COVID in 2020.
Indeed. So we're coming up on the 3-year anniversary of his Easter resurrection. You remember when he left to go to the hospital, and a week later, like Lazarus, rose on Easter Sunday to give this stunning address to the public. This is just, let's take a look at what was said at the time.
Just the first few seconds of what he said at the time.
Turn back the clock, ladies and gentlemen, and reimagine this whole scenario. Watch.
Good afternoon. I've today left hospital after a week in which the NHS has saved my life, no question. It's hard to find words to express my debt, but before I come to that, I want to thank everyone in the entire UK for the effort and the sacrifice you have made and are making. When the sun is out and the kids are at home, when the whole natural world seems at its loveliest and the outdoors is so inviting, I can only imagine how tough it has been to follow the rules on social distancing.
So there we go. It's so tough.
I can only imagine how tough it must be for you plebs at home. So questions have arisen now in recent weeks, and this has been going on, boiling under the surface for the last year. Was Boris telling the truth about his brush with death, with COVID, right? And did he fake his COVID illness here? And we'll put this up on screen. This is an article by Neil McRae. Did Boris Johnson fake his COVID illness? And that's the big question here. So in this article features, this was what was going on at the time. Piers Morgan took to Twitter and he said, if you're not rooting for our prime minister tonight and willing to make waiting for him to make a speedy recovery, then you're a despicable human being, says Piers Morgan. He is very ill with a deadly virus, and his pregnant partner has also been sick. Incredibly worrying time for them and for the country. Come on, Boris, says Piers Morgan, the virtue signaler and a chief whip of the COVID NHS campaign.
Yes.
So that's what he was saying here. So here we go. Look at this. At the time, Boris said that the hospital doctors were ready to announce his death. So he claimed, and this is widely reported at the time, this is Politico here, that they were preparing to announce his death. So Boris almost bought the farm within a 7-day period. At his age, how old was he? Late 50s or early 50s, mid 50s or something like that. So he's not elderly, right?
Right.
So and I guess he's in fairly good health. So look, that was what was said at the time. How true is these claims? And that's what people are asking here. And so go back to here, and this is a statement by the author here, Neil McRae. Now, I've heard many people say that Johnson seemed a changed man when he returned to duties in Downing Street. Could that be because he had just told the biggest and boldest lie of his life? Did you notice that too? That was a different Boris, wasn't it?
It was.
When he came back, visibly different Boris. So, and again, now this is interesting. This is where it gets interesting. Where does this challenge come from? This is an organization called Stop Lying in Politics. It's run by investigative journalist Marcus J. Ball. He's got a documentary film coming up here, and I believe he's working with or got material from the Guardian political editor, which we just showed, and maybe from Isabella Oakeshott as well with the Matt Hancock test. Our documentary film is an unsettling answer to this question, working hard on finishing it. I can't wait to see this film, Mike. But this is his organization, Stop Lying to Politics. He also got a prosecution, but not a decision in his favor, taking Boris Johnson to court for lying over the claim of 350 million pounds per week going to the EU. Remember during the Brexit and Leave and the Remain battle?
Yes.
This was on the battle bus. So they went to court. The charge didn't stick, but he did get the case to court. It did make prosecution through. So Marcus J. Ball is serious about this. He's pursuing Boris on the COVID lie as well. So I don't know if he's going to get any joy on that. He's asked for a freedom of information request from the information minister from St. Thomas's Hospital to get all the information about the Prime Minister. How long was he there? Was he there? How sick was he? And so forth. So that's in the process right now. That could come out in the film.
So the point is here, did he lie over lockdown? Did he lie over lockdown parties? Were the lockdown parties legal or illegal? And so is he continuing to lie by the fact that he's not offering any kind of serious defence on it, other than I didn't mean to mislead Parliament? And did he lie about his illness in the first place? And what kind of person is Boris Johnson? That seems to me what we're saying here.
Well, he's always had a question over his credibility, but this also basically undercuts the whole left wing. And this is what Neil McRae says in this article, Mike, and this is the important part. The whole left wing Labour socialist argument is that Boris is guilty of mass murder because he didn't lock down soon enough, because he didn't recognize the danger of COVID soon enough. And the comments on herd immunity, you remember the first announcement before they flip-flopped into lockdown. He said, we're going to pursue herd immunity. And there was immediate visceral backlash from the left and the media saying how inhumane of the Tories, of Boris, to call us like a herd of cattle and so forth. They're throwing us into the fire, as it were, the funeral pyres.
Yes.
So that's the left-wing argument. Now, if he was basically, completely lying about all this stuff, and that the government was lying about the severity of COVID-19, and they claimed it was an infection fatality rate of 3.5% up to 5%, that's totally fake. Totally false. So that's the real problem with all of this. But you can see how the left is angled to say, no, lock down harder. So I like the way that this argument was constructed in this article, and I encourage people to go pick that up online.
Okay, well, look, let's finish with this story. So this is the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Bill is now in act as of today, or yesterday, I think, yesterday. This is now in act, as we can see. So let's just remind ourselves what this is about. So first of all, it will remove plants and animals that have been produced through precision breeding technologies from regulatory requirements applicable in England to the environmental release and marketing of GMOs. So gene editing is no longer genetic modification. It's a separate thing. According to the government, it's going to introduce 2 new notification systems, one for precision bred organisms used for research processes and the other for marketing purposes. In other words, for us to buy and eat. The information collected will be published on a public register on gov.uk. It's going to establish a proportionate regulatory system for precision-bred animals to ensure animal welfare is safeguarded. We will not be introducing changes to the regulations for animals until this system is in place. And it's going to establish a new science-based authorization process for food and feed products derived from using precision-bred plants and animals. So what do they mean by precision-bred plants and animals? They mean plants and animals that have been gene-edited in order to, for example, make them more safer from, to reduce the use of pesticides. But basically, they're claiming that this is taking what has up until now been a natural process of selective breeding and something which takes a long period of time, and to use CRISPR and other gene editing technologies in order to shorten that time into months or a couple of years rather than generations, to make it some kind of genetic change.
So basically deregulating GMO and gene editing.
No, not GMO, right?
Loosening or redefining.
So this is a key point. This is a key point. What they're saying is they're claiming that this is not genetic modification because they're not introducing foreign genes from another organism into the initial organism. They're editing the genes that the organism already has. This is not true because, in fact, the process often includes bringing genes from a foreign organism into the organism that you're editing, so long as when you produce or when you provide that organism for marketing, when somebody wants to eat the product, that the foreign gene has been removed again. So in other words, it's okay to use a foreign gene in order to, as part of the process of getting to your end point.
So
right?
It's a semantic change.
It's a semantic change.
It's sophistry, typical
sophistry. Let's remind ourselves what Joe Churchill said in 2022. New genetic technologies could help us tackle some of the biggest challenges of our age around food security, climate change, and biodiversity loss. How about paying for farmers not to take How about paying for farmers not to take land out of production? Would that not do something about food security rather than this?
Unbelievable.
Right. So let's just have a look at a couple of, well, first of all, who is pushing this as hard as he possibly can?
I don't know, maybe Bill Gates?
No. Who's on screen at the moment? Tony Blair. Tony Blair is pushing this. Gene editing and food production, charting a way forward. This is something that the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change is very, very keen to promote. But let's look at some people that aren't so keen to promote it. Here is a paper on Springer Open, broadening the GMO risk assessment in the EU for genome editing technologies in agriculture. And it says, however, there are numerous reports of unintended effects such as off-target effects, unintended on-target effects, and other unintended consequences arising from genome editing, summarized under the term genomic irregularities. We show that genome editing techniques are able to produce a broad spectrum of novel traits that thus far were not possible to be attained using conventional breeding techniques. So this is not about replicating what happens naturally through selective breeding. This is producing traits which don't happen naturally through selective breeding. Here is the National. Food experts slam the BBC for lies about genetic editing of foods. Dr. Michael Antonio, a genetics expert from King's College London School of Medicine, said the BBC's reporting misrepresented the facts and was economic with the truth at the best. This is where it gets really disingenuous. Under the new bill, insertion of foreign DNA is part and parcel of the deregulation. That's no longer a bill, it's an act of Parliament now. He went on to say it's not as if being deregulated is only gene edits that tweak or destroy the function of genes which are already there. It's also the insertion of foreign genetic material. They're basically deregulating all manner of genetic manipulations of crops, not just crops, animals as well. If we're looking at surprising outcomes, here's a report. Scientists really surprised after gene editing experiment unexpectedly turned hamsters into hyper-aggressive bullies.
That's not difficult to do. If you take that hamster and you put it in Westminster for a couple of weeks, you get the same outcome.
So they used Syrian hamsters, they used CRISPR, and they were expecting to reduce the aggression of the hamsters. Instead, they increased the aggression of the hamsters. So really, quite incredible that this is now passed as an act of Parliament. It's now legal to do with barely a comment from anybody, any activists. And I mean, so there have been some activists campaigning on this, but certainly nothing in the press.
So just opening the floodgates for total GMO massive abuse. And it's a gravy train, isn't it, Mike? There's companies behind this that are ready to sink their teeth into huge contracts, huge markets and stuff like that. Do we actually need it? That's the question.
Well, no, we don't.
What's wrong with the soil and food we have? I don't know.
Precisely, we just need to get our farmers growing again. And just to finish off here then, Sharon Davies tweeting out this morning to thank you to the Sebastian Coe and the World Athletics authorities for standing up for female athletes across the world who are worthy of fair sport. This is because the World Athletics regulator has now decided that trans athletes will not be allowed to take part in women's sport anymore.
Fantastic. That's a victory for common sense, isn't it? And let's just end with a feel-good story here. Greta Thunberg, that's St. Greta of the Rising Seas, she's been given an honorary doctorate here from the University of Helsinki in Finland. They're giving her a doctorate of theology. Isn't that amazing, Mike?
Excellent.
Considering that climatism is the new state global religion. So
Yes,
only
indeed.
fitting that Greta gets a doctorate. She didn't have to go into any classes. That was the great thing. So that she had time to do her campaigning, and she doesn't have to spend time studying and things like that.
Yeah, brilliant.
That's fantastic. Congratulations, Greta.
Greta. Yeah, well done.
Dr. Greta.
Dr. Greta.
Dr. Greta. Yeah.
Okay, let's leave it there for today. Thank you to Vanessa and Patrick for joining us. We'll be back in a few minutes for some extra. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.